honored but also challenged to speak to such an expert audience. I'm going to use that fact against you and not take you through all the facts that I will assume that you already know. If not from your own work, then definitely from what the two previous speakers said already. And I will mostly offer you some interpretations of these facts from my perspective. The perspective that I'm using here, it's the perspective of human rights lawyer. I founded my own NGO called Panoptykon Foundation, which I manage, but also I do legal work and a lot of what we call lobbying, simply in favor of human rights safeguards, both in Poland and the European Union. But I'm also part of European Digital Rights Coalition, where I serve as vice president for the last 3 years, which brings me closer to Brussels and all the political games happening there. So these are the fields where I move around and from which I come with my, so to say, interpretations of what happened over the last 10 months. So for me, the story of post-Snowden surveillance debate is a story of crossing the red lines. The red lines that should never be crossed in democratic society, and much has been said already today, and not only today, about this. But I think we should keep repeating this so that it becomes striking why, as free societies, we got down to this point where certain red lines has been crossed. Not in our favor, because definitely it's not in favor of our rights. I will offer you a few ideas that I have. It's my personal choice of the main points that should never become reality while they did. Of course, inviting you to discuss with me, because I would be really happy to hear your views or where your red lines should be drawn. The first one is the obvious one, and the one that Gemma mentioned just when she invited us for this panel. But again, that's the fundamental one. I mean, surveillance should never be about innocent citizens. It may be legitimate. I don't like that idea, but as a lawyer, I can accept that it exists. This concept of legitimate surveillance can be defended, but only under very strict safeguards, under very strict circumstances, which is no longer the case. We always had that impression. We always discussed, not always, but at least for the last 10 years, we discussed Patriot Act, FISA, all these legal measures, but only after Snowden it became official that what we have now really is about mass blanket surveillance of, if not all, then at least very many innocent citizens, including journalists, lawyers, people who should be protected and not exposed. But it's not the end of this problem. Also, we've been told that terrorism is no longer about people that we imagine on the other side of the world. It's also about journalists like Glenn Greenwald, Laura Poitras, and their cooperatives. It's about everybody who dares to object to current policies. Also, these people are subjected, and maybe many of us here, to the same treatment as formerly foreign militants and so-called terrorists. Even more, we have learned that it's no longer about public security. What I mean here, of course, is the reference to recent revelations about Bull Run program and the Heartbleed bag. Things that should never happen because they are exactly against our security, both as individuals and as societies as a whole. So if our intelligence services are ready to corrupt security of the systems and communication systems that we are using just in order to have better access to our data, it really means that it's no longer about our security, but it's about their vested interest. And that's something that should never happen, but it does. Second big issue for me, strikingly, was that the surveillance of political allies turned out to be somehow legitimate. When I heard for the first time that Angela Merkel, Dilma Rousseff, UN officials and people of that standing were under surveillance, I was actually hopeful that that will become a breakthrough in the whole debate. And it was very loud in the media, of course it was. And we heard a lot of strong political rhetoric. But as you will notice yourselves, nothing really changed. Not a single political alliance has been broken or weakened because of these developments. On the contrary, Germany is the major player behind a pending US-EU trade deal. And Dilma Rousseff has just now organized a big conference called Net Mondial, which was supposed to be some kind of response to mass surveillance, but turned out to be nothing much more than a regular internet governance forum where the governments and other stakeholders meet for a kind conversation with no real political outcome. So that's something that was quite striking as well. Third big issue that I want to stress here, it's what already Ben extensively explained to us. The democratic checks and balances failed miserably, both in US and in EU. None of the existing oversight bodies was able to detect this mass surveillance system, not to say to prevent them from becoming reality. Even though we are using here taxpayers' money, and even from the budgetary perspective, it should be quite easy to detect that something of that size and scale is happening. What I think was grotesque is that one example from US where it turned out through Washington Post that even internal NSA audit that confirmed that NSA infringed US existing law got requested by the respective Senate committee only 1 year later after it was created, and just because it became a big news in the US media. That only shows that the amount of available information and the paperwork probably it's too big to be consumed and comprehended by people like congressmen, which, what I want to stress, refers both to US and to Europe. A fourth issue is that secrecy has been abused, and we know that it has been abused to hide both big political mistakes and major human rights abuses. And here I want to use some Polish examples, so I don't target just US government, they've got enough already from today. I'm sure you have heard about Polish involvement in secret renditions program and CIA secret prisons. We had one for years, and it took 8 years for that case to get to European Court of Human Rights. 8 years for justice process to begin, and we still don't know how many years we have to come before there is any judgment or any accountability. And the major tool used against citizens, against the victims of these abuses, was obviously secrecy. After PRISM became a known fact, we started digging into this issue in Poland using something we called Freedom of Information law, so-called FOIA requests. My foundation issued 362 requests for information in October last year, digging into many details of this affair, trying to identify to what extent mass surveillance affected Polish citizens and to what extent Polish intelligence was involved. Not many of these issues were secret in our opinion. We got very few responses, and of course none of the key ones. We are still struggling in courts, and it will probably take for us 2, 4, maybe even 5 years in Poland just to fight for these pieces of information. We also started investigating how many times state authorities ask about internet users, just to get an idea of the scale and maybe interpret from this scale whether we have PRISM or similar programs. Funny enough, it turned out easier for us to talk to companies who revealed more information than to the governments. And this is the data that I show here. It's just pieces of the full report that you have available in English. I left a few copies there, but more, of course, is available online. So what we haven't learned from state authorities, because they thought it was secret enough to refuse, we learned mostly from the companies who were ready to talk to us because they thought it was legitimate for citizens to know the scale of requests. Well, last but not least, red line that I identified for myself is the role of private companies in all that. It is striking what we have seen in October last year when a coalition of major internet companies, including Google, Facebook, Amazon, appealed to US government to curb what they see as excessive surveillance. That was after they realized that it's actually detrimental for their reputation and for their relationships with their clients. But they never acknowledged their role in this system, and the mere fact that what they are collecting now is far more than is necessary for providing services. And if they didn't collect this data, there might be much less to seize by the governments. So for me, that one development was extremely worrying for another reason, which is that now big corporations are shaping human rights policy. When I've read the letter, which was basically about human rights standards, I felt excluded from this game as a citizen. Nobody consulted me whether I agree with Google and Facebook negotiating with Obama the shape of his reform, which was basically the case. Well, what I want to invite you now to look at is, oh, okay, we don't have it. That's funny. Apparently I sent a different version, but I had in another version of this presentation, which I'm happy to send you if you wish so, I have a list of political events that happened in the EU since Snowden until now. So what we had, I mean, we had July when Snowden basically asked for asylum in 21 states, including many of the European member states. Almost all of them refused his request, therefore he ended up in Russia. In the same month, European Parliament started its investigation in PRISM affair, which was the only investigation that ever happened, including US Congress. So the only body who started some form of investigation in this issue was European Parliament, the last body, I would say, in terms of competence and powers to do something meaningful in this respect. In the same month, we had also the first resolution in the European Parliament criticizing PRISM and demanding more accountability, but at the same time saying, okay, we will not stop trade talks because trade is important enough for us to proceed with, even though human rights are threatened. As a result of that, also in July last year, there was the first round of negotiations over the new big trade deal between EU and US called Transatlantic Investment Partnership. This is happening now. After that, we have seen European Commission making a lot of big political rhetoric and claiming that that current agreements allowing for data flows between EU and US, like PNR, SWIFT, and similar, should be suspended because of what we have learned through Snowden revelations. But nothing like that happened. And in December, European Commission, the same body, basically made very weak communication saying that what we need to do is to rebuild mutual trust, as if the trust was broken on both sides of the Atlantic, not mostly on one American side. That was striking for us because as citizens over previous 6 months, we were hopeful to see that Safe Harbor Agreement and similar agreements will be frozen. There was everything on the table, politically, legally, all evidence was available to make that step, and still it didn't happen. Why? Because trade obviously was more important, and this is exactly what we can read in this communication from December. In the same month, December, we had important EU summit that made the same statements. It's all about trade now. We will stop working on new European data protection package because there is no political consensus on how we want to move forward with the data protection reform, but we will move forward with TTIP, with the new trade deal, because that one is important. So even if it was just 6 months after Snowden, and already not a single decision maker was careful enough to at least play with us the game that they played back in July, promising that something will change. Finally, in March this year, we had the first critical resolution of European Parliament, which was the end of this investigation I mentioned a second ago. And that resolution was the first one to admit that we have enough evidence to really say that PRISM happened, that mass surveillance is a political fact and it should be dealt with somehow. So that was the major success we arrived in after 10 months from Snowden revelations. Well, so I will not even mention Obama reform that happened in January, where we haven't really seen the problem of mass surveillance of European citizens being handled, just minor corrections in American legal system. So this is where we are now, and when we look at this, it's very difficult not to share Snowden's main concern, that whatever he did will basically end up with knowledge that we have now, but there will be no major change or shift in politics, because there are too many vested corporate or governmental interests to be protected, and that change is just for the citizens, but not for those who hold power. One more thing I want to add, just considering where the hope might come from. European courts. I hope many of you have heard about the recent case where European Court of Justice decided that the Data Retention Directive, the main surveillance instrument being used for mass surveillance in Europe, is invalid and has always been invalid because it's not in line with EU law. So we have that one, so to say, off the table. We've been fighting with this instrument for the last 7 years, and it's done. But at the same time, there is no shift in policy, because once the blanket data retention has been whitewashed in Brussels as the obligatory policy, member states, they don't have to move back. They simply used European law as an excuse to implement these additional intelligence powers back home. But because they are still sovereign and that because they still hold their national security policies for themselves, they can claim they don't have to delete their own laws just because the European law was deleted. And that shows a very worrying process, how Brussels is being used and abused by national intelligence agencies or governments to increase surveillance powers. And only courts can stop it, but it's a very lengthy process and also another fight for us to work on. Well, my final question basically for you, maybe to open some discussion, would be what really is our main enemy in this struggle? Is it the lack of political accountability that we've been discussing today quite a lot, or is it the fear of becoming suspected or exposed ourselves just for the sake, just because we dare to say that mass surveillance is no longer legitimate and that we want it to be stopped? Aren't we afraid of becoming terrorism in this new system? I'm asking this question because this is the feeling that I experienced myself recently when a colleague of mine, it's a work relationship, not a private one, got caught red-handed by Polish police being drunk, driving and using his gun that he got a license for. It immediately became a major news in the country, and I thought, the first thought I had, and all of my friends, we shared the same thought, how lucky that we were not involved in his drunken driving and his illegitimate use of weapon. And our second thought was, well, isn't it just the surveillance mechanism happening just for us in our lives? Obviously, we were afraid because being exposed as human rights offenders, it would be a very good argument against our work because we could be linked to that person who became suddenly a criminal. On the other hand, we have nothing to hide. So the second thing we did was to text him to give him a sign of support that we are not paralyzed by this fear. But experiencing this fear, you start thinking, can we still do our job as human rights offenders, having so much surveillance happening and having all these mechanisms like blanket data retention, PRISM, upstream, whatever is there in stake for us? Thank you for your attention, and I hope we will have time to discuss more.